Episode 21, Hawking Newspapers. Every Murphy kid was expected to get a part-time job as soon as possible. My older brother and sister Maureen had done so. My younger sisters Claire, Ellen, and Brenda had many babysitting jobs, including taking care of Maureen's kids. Claire reminded me recently that she worked part-time at the Brigham's Ice Cream in Central Square and other restaurants too. Brenda told me that she had a part-time job at the Mount Auburn Hospital. Ellen worked at the Central Pipe and Supply as a typist and switchboard operator. Maureen worked part-time at the Hotel Commander, as did Gary and I. Child labor laws were extant, but mostly ignored at that time. When I was about 8, I remember looking around to find a well-paid but fun job. I considered the oilman who drove tank trucks around the neighborhood looking for cellar oil tanks that needed filling. Usually there was a kid working part-time on the truck. But that job, although lucrative, was particularly dirty, seasonal, and very cold. Every itinerant vendor or established merchant who came into our neighborhood was preceded by his voice. Unlike today, when salesmen visit by phone or internet, we had loud, live, raucous, memorable, and sometimes melodious characters peddling their wares with shouted fanfare. I loved the many horse and wagon vendors and the metal scrap buyers who clopped through the area, hollering their wares and services to women in the flats. Icemen, junk men, fruit and vegetable peddlers, knife sharpeners, ragmen, cooked blue crab wagons, etc., were all part of my landscape. One of the most colorful was the merry-go-round truck. Its carousel music could be heard blocks away. It was a mobile merry-go-round with up and round riding horses. Many of these vendors hired kids part-time. There were many milkmen, and they hired some kids. Ice cream trucks and the small pushcart vendors selling various things sometimes hired a kid. There were kids working at the neighborhood convenience stores, although they were mostly the shop owners' children. There were jobs for kids usually up at the Ave, which is the nickname for the Central Square area, where all the big stores were located. We did not use a milkman, so another one of my chores was lugging half gallons of milk from the First National Store or the First Nash every day. It was much less expensive than the milkman. Without a connection to one of those regular tradesmen, I did not have a chance at those kind of jobs. We did not use those tradesmen because it was more expensive, and my mother and father were very careful with their sparse money. We were not very friendly to those tradesmen, and I don't know why. Perhaps because my father did not frequent the area saloons, as most neighborhood fathers did. So he did not meet the tradesmen there personally. My opportunities were elsewhere. My first paying job was selling newspapers in front of the Riverside Press, which was a textbook publishing factory owned by Houghton Mifflin Company. It was located next to the Charles River at Memorial Drive and River Street. I was about 8 years old. John O'Connell, later to become a Boston dentist, was the oldest of 11 kids from a great family. He had the rights there and I worked for him. There were shifts at the factory that ended at 4, 4:30, and 5 p.m. At those times, workers streamed out through a central door and had to pass us. We stood on either side of the crowd with armfuls of the Boston newspapers, handing out papers and taking in money from the workers. We put the change in our Boston Globe coin aprons. In between shifts, I would hawk the papers up and down the going home traffic that had stopped at the traffic lights on River Street and Memorial Drive, and shouting loudly, Globe, Traveler, and American, the three most popular newspapers. Before the first Riverside Press shift, my responsibility was also to visit and sell papers to other local businesses, like Elbury Ford, the automobile dealership across the street. I would hand newspapers to about 10 Elbury employees and take their money. I would then go to other local businesses every day. But I would walk by that candy vending machine in the Elbury mechanics work area every day also. I began to notice a wax paper piece of pie on top of the vending machine. I found out later that it was coconut custard pie and pretty exotic for me. Since this was long after lunch, I figured someone had not eaten part of his lunch. I would see what I thought was the same piece of coconut custard pie for 2 or 3 days. Then I would grab it and eat it as I went back across the street to the paper stand. This happened every 2 or 3 days. The pie would appear again after I scoffed it. One fateful day, and without giving it a second thought, I reached up to take that pie again as I was leaving, and I was pounced on by Mr. Elbury himself, the owner. It seems that I was eating his afternoon snack. I tried to explain that I thought it was unwanted since it was there so long. He told me that he ate the same snack every day, and every day it was always fresh. He wasn't angry. There must have been a regular detective mystery going on before they caught the culprit. The case of the stolen custard pie. Dun, 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 dun. We sold all the afternoon papers: the Traveler, the Globe, the American, and the Post. The price was a nickel. The job took from 3 o'clock to 5:30 after school, Monday through Friday. On Sunday, in front of the Blessed Sacrament Church, I sometimes also worked for John O'Connell, selling Sunday papers after all the masses. I earned $5 to $7 plus tips a week from those two jobs. All of us gave our earned money to Mother, who, from my $7, doled out to me $2 a week. I also kept my tips. The rest went to the general welfare of the family. My big brother Gary thought highly of my entrepreneurial instincts. He suggested that I start my own paper hawking business. The fact that I was pretty good at hawking papers to stop traffic was the key. Central Square and Harvard Square were already staked out by adult dealers, but there were many other good spots. There were traffic lights just made for the street hawking of newspapers. The first spot I tried was near Lechmere Square, where the Prison Point Bridge crosses over the Charles River into Boston, near the present location of the Boston Museum of Science. I would walk to Central Square and buy a number of newspapers from the individual publishers, Jewish wholesalers, Sam, Sid, and a very ugly younger man whose last name was Rosenberg. I would then pull them in my red wagon and hike to the Prison Point Bridge, which was a long hike. Although I did okay there, I decided to try a closer to home location, the Lars Anderson Bridge over the Charles. It was near the Harvard College sculling shed on the Charles River, just as busy as the other spot. I began to sell more newspapers, and I was quicker getting home after the rush hour. I was taking home about $12 a week on this deal. I was still getting only $2 from my mother, though. That is, until the Canarneys struck. This bunch of ragged Mick thugs were roughly my age. Unfortunately, I had to go through a fringe of their turf, Kerry Corner, to get home. They discovered not only was I alone, so they could bully me, but I had money from my newspaper sales. The first day they threw my remaining papers without receiving any credit from that. The next time they got me was on my way to my selling corner. They threw all my papers in the river again. Each time I fought them, but was beaten by their superior numbers. They did not do this every day, and like most males of that era, and probably the present era too, I needed to handle the problem myself with no adult help. I think this is the beginnings of responsibility. Reality and independence began. To carry a club underneath the papers was my idea. They had not yet been able to get my money. I would give up my papers Hobson choice like under physical threats, but never give up my gelt. There were different young thugs sometimes with them, but the Canarneys were always there. Note, at least one of the Canarneys did hard time at the Walpole State Prison later on in life. The last time they tried it, I pulled out my club when I saw them and threatened the first one with a fucking broken head. It was a standoff, and I was able to go home without being robbed. A few times after that, my friends who sometimes came with me in my club kept them away. Finally, they left me alone. Thank you for viewing or listening to my podcast episode. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, and if you so choose, I ask you to send a good review and perhaps refer friends who might be interested in this podcast series. Again, my thanks.